After a calamitous evening, Theresa May lost her withdrawal agreement by 391 to 242 votes. This paves the way towards either us rejecting or accepting a no-deal Brexit. If we reject a no-deal Brexit, this could take us onto the most viable path of Brexit, which would be a common market 2.0. Also referred to as the European Economic Area or Norway Plus, this type of deal would allow us to obtain the economic benefits of EU membership without having to accept freedom of movement, as well as giving us the power to reject certain EU bills. Now, if on the other hand we accept a no-deal Brexit, this puts us onto WTO rules. If we go onto WTO rules, this will mean that effectively we will have tariffs on our goods being exported to the EU, leading to loss of jobs, leading to loss of economic growth. It could also mean that goods being imported into the UK have an increased tariff. For instance, the car automobile industry. If there are tariffs of 10% on the automobile industry, which it is likely for there to be, then the average car price is expected to increase by £1,500. Now, taking all this into account, we will then enter into a recession, higher unemployment, and this will probably lead us to having to get out of that economic pain by then giving away our sovereignty to American firms. So now, I'm going to go off and talk to a few Remainers and Brexiteers about this issue. Thank you. Hello, so I am here today with a Leave supporter, I believe. I was just wondering, so what are your opinions on a no-deal Brexit?
Yeah, I'm perfectly fine with no-deal Brexit. I think after the 29th of March, I think pretty much the next day, the EU will come crawling back to us, desperate to do a deal because their economies are in free fall. They need our money, so I think they'll be desperate for a deal, and we'll have the power then.
I mean, do you realise that if we go for a no-deal Brexit, our economy will very much be in free fall? I mean, it's predicted that we will lose 9% of economic growth if we go and do a no-deal Brexit. We will have tariffs on our exports to the EU, which will affect both goods being exported to the EU, but also those who are importing into our country from other countries outside the EU and who are trying to export then to the EU. So we will have 9% of GDP growth lost and high unemployment and probably a loss of sovereignty to America, who will eventually have to go and give our sovereignty away to.
There's a lot of predictions flying about, mainly from the Remain sides, so I wouldn't pay too much attention to that. I mean, the EU wants to do a deal with us. We'll be able to do a deal with them, I'm pretty sure. We've got a massive deficit with them, 95 billion apparently, deficit, so.
I mean, that deficit you could take as more a problem on our side than their side. I guess you're talking about the trade deficit.
Yeah, we buy more from them than we sell to them, so.
I mean, yes, I mean, if we put tariffs on those, that will affect our consumers, and our prices will rise in our country.
Then we need to get a deal done quickly with the EU then. I'm sure they want a deal, we want a deal, but after the 29th of March.
Okay. So have you heard of the Norway Plus option?
Yes.
What's your opinion on that?
No, I don't think it would work because you'd still have immigration, you'd have to follow all the EU rules, you'd have to pay into the budget, so it's not a goer. We're a big economy, so we don't need to do that.
Well, actually, only 30% of EU laws, which are economic laws, we'd have to obey by under Norway. We'd also be able to have a checkout clause on freedom of movement, and also when it comes to the EU budget, we wouldn't have to supply any money to common agricultural policy or any other of the policies. So it would only mean we'd have to pay 50% of the actual budget that we currently pay.
I don't know. I think you actually want a clean break, really. I mean, it might sound bad, but I think clear the decks, get a trade deal done. I think we'll be okay.
Okay. I mean,
I'm not worried.
Are you worried that possibly if we have a no-deal Brexit, What if it doesn't? I mean, it's not going to affect the EU as much as it is the UK. I mean, our trade with them is 13%. Theirs with us is 48% of our economy. Are you aware that if we do not get a deal and it takes ages, and then we eventually have to give our sovereignty away to American firms selling us chlorinated chicken? Isn't that more of a worry than EU?
I'm not sure the amount of trade. Our amount of trade is 48%. I think it's more like 13% or something. It's not, or it's 8%. It's not 48%.
48% of our exports are to the EU.
Oh, sorry, exports. I thought you meant the whole trade, but no.
Yes, yeah.
Well, we need to work something out with them, but we can't work anything out until we've actually left and become a third country. So I believe that's the way forward, you know.
All right, okay. Thank you very much for having your discussion. Lovely to meet you. I am here today with a Remainer. Could I first ask, what is your name?
My name's Ruth Fryer.
All right, lovely to meet you. Okay, so what are your thoughts on straight away tonight, no, not tonight, but following nights they decide to completely revoke Article 50?
That would be the most wonderful dream come true.
Don't you think that's going against the referendum result?
The referendum result was fraudulent and illegal and should never have been respected in the first place. It has been shown to be illegal.
Okay, do you accept that maybe on the other side there is the argument that, I mean, there was flyers put through lots of people's doors about Remain. There was also a lot of funding and spending that were also on the Remain side as were on the Leave side.
There was an awful lot of things that were very poorly handled at the beginning of the referendum, for which I am not responsible. But putting something on a leaflet is not the same as having a binding document, an Act of Parliament.
Okay, but I mean, that binding legal document is actually because we voted to leave the European Union. Unfortunately, I voted to remain. Oh, well, actually, I didn't get a vote, but I would have voted to remain. But as the people have decided, surely we should leave the European Union.
Well, since it's very clear that that would be hugely damaging on every possible level, and to talk about the will of the people for something that's shown to be fraudulent, and the so-called 52% that voted on that day only represents 37% of the electorate, which is only 25% of the population as a whole. To do something as drastic as leaving the EU on that basis, claiming erroneously that this is the will of the people, to me is a total nonsense. I totally despair at the quality of our MPs. It's high time they did the job they were paid for, put national interest first and revoke Article 50.
Well, I mean, if instead they go and get a deal, they get a Norway-style agreement, they get Norway Plus, where we remain very closely aligned to the EU, and we can revoke freedom of movement. We can also have, as I said, very close alignment to the EU, whilst also not having to pay as much towards the EU budget. Then have a second referendum on all the options. Would you be okay with that?
If that's the route that it has to go,
okay.
It would seem to me that putting this thing about the freedom of movement, which is so obviously such a valuable thing, that deprives me of an awful lot of my rights. So I'd be very sad to see that go.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think probably the main argument with the Brexiteer argument was take back control. That's mainly an argument about sovereignty, and necessarily even sovereignty over having the right to go and decide how many people migrate to your country. However, if you have another referendum and it repeals that decision, there is the argument that necessarily you will just keep going on and on. We could have another referendum because people aren't happy on the Brexiteer side for remaining, and then it could just go on forever.
Well, this argument about continual referendums is why I'd be actually very worried about referendum. Yeah, we've seen that it's not a good way of trying to decide things. So to use it again would seem to me to be an odd way of going about things. The main essence of Brexit was that it would either be bankrupt Brexit or bend over Brexit. Alternatively, painful or pointless. So
Okay.
I can't. If you're going to go for the Norway Plus, which would seem to be a sort of pointless, well, why not stay in and have all the benefits of staying in?
Well, I guess with the Norway Plus, you'll lose it. You don't have to pay as much, and also you have much more rights inside of the EU. And probably on the Brexiteer side, you can say, like even Michael Portillo, one of those John Major particularly did not like in the 1990s period, very much a Brexiteer, says that he likes the Norway option because you don't have to get into the closer union, and that's what people are worried about. But you're saying that that we could just do it without having a referendum, so you could repeal the people's will. Unfortunately, we run out of space, but however, we have carried on our discussion, and we have just been discussing about the illegalities of the referendum decision. Could you please continue with what you were saying?
Oh, I've kind of lost my thread now.
Oh, okay. So what do you believe was wrong with the referendum decision?
It has been shown that there were a number of illegalities and a number of problems with it, including the possibility of foreign money, unaccounted money, what we might call dark money, and the use of social media and the use of Cambridge Analytica. There's a lot of questions that haven't been answered, and while it all hangs there and we're waiting for the full information to become public, to me it would make sense to revoke Article 50 and then pursue all those issues, and when everything is clarified, I would look at it again.
I would say on the side of Cambridge Analytica that just simply having lots of social media put out won't necessarily change everybody's decision. Suddenly I want to go for leave. I mean, if I just see an advertisement going for shoes, that doesn't mean I'm going to buy it. It just means that it's slightly influencing.
Nobody knows, do they? And I think that's the point.
All right, thank you very much, Ruth. It was lovely talking to you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So it has been a very interesting evening today. I've spoke both to a Leaver and a Remainer. The Leaver made some very interesting points on the case of the WTO or no deal, that despite possible economic pain, he believed that leaving the European Union and obtaining more sovereignty was much more important to him, and it's a very viable option. However, I would argue that the Norway option gives you all of these things without the economic pain. In the case of the Remainer, she was very much for the Norway option and then a second referendum. She was more on the illegalities of the referendum campaign. And although I very much agree with some of the cases, I do not believe that that makes the referendum necessarily null and void, because the case is that small, minute changes in voting patterns do not determine what happens in a referendum. Just because you might see a social media thing about leaving does not mean that you will necessarily vote for leave. It's on your own preference. So therefore I believe the first referendum is valid, and the argument for a second referendum after leaving the European Union is also valid, whilst also obtaining a Norway-style agreement. Thank you very much. That was Daily Herald on the 13th of March. Pop your head out.